Olá, boa tarde. O grande propósito da inovação é transformar a sociedade e melhorar a qualidade de vida e o ambiente que nos rodeia. Mas, por vezes, focamos no valor da inovação, na inovação em si, e esquecemos do impacto que esta cria nas pessoas. É por esta razão que nós na Unipartner temos vindo constantemente a incorporar novas abordagens de change management, para que os nossos projetos de gestão de inovação digital atinjam os seus objetivos de negócio, mas sejam verdadeiramente human-centric. E é por esta razão, e é um enorme prazer, que a Unipartner nos traz hoje o David Schonthal. O David Schonthal é advisor da IDEO e professor na Kellogg School of Management. O David desenvolveu uma framework focada neste desafio de gestão da mudança e lançou recentemente um livro que já é um best-seller do Wall Street com o nome que diz tudo, The Human Element. Hi, David. Thank you for being here. Have a great session. And the stage now is yours.
Well, hello. It's nice to be with you virtually, at least. My name is David Schonthal. There's a few different hats that I wear, as you might have heard in the introduction. One is as a professor at the Kellogg School of Management, where I teach classes on innovation, entrepreneurship, and design thinking. Outside of Kellogg, I work in venture capital, helping young companies get new ideas into the market, and spent about a decade in design consulting with IDEO. And together with my co-author, Lauren Nordgren, have written this book called The Human Element, which is around why people resist change and new ideas, which obviously has a lot of application to everything from consulting to innovation to product commercialization and even organizational change and designing new movements and initiatives around companies. And the metaphor that I want to use to kick this idea off with you is this one. It's a bullet. And if you think about a bullet, what makes a bullet fly? Bullets, when fired from a gun, can travel as many as 2 miles, hitting their target with absolute precision, pinpoint accuracy. What is it that makes a bullet fly that distance with that level of precision? Now, most people's instinct about what makes a bullet fly when you ask this question, and if we were in a room together, I'm guessing many of you would say gunpowder, which is not untrue. That is absolutely part of the answer. Gunpowder creates pressure in the barrel, which forces the bullet out the end of the barrel towards its target with a tremendous amount of power. But gunpowder isn't a wrong answer, it's just an incomplete answer. Because on a way to its target, a bullet encounters all sorts of forces working against its progress. It encounters wind resistance, it encounters drag, it encounters gravity pulling it down to the ground. And unless a bullet is able to overcome these forces working against it, it will fail to reach its destination and fail to reach it with accuracy. So while gunpowder isn't a wrong answer, the true answer is that it's gunpowder that propels a bullet forward, but it's also the aerodynamics of the bullet and the rotation of the bullet that allows it to cut through wind resistance and cut through drag and fight the forces of gravity. So it's not just the fuel that propels it, it's also its ability to overcome the headwinds and friction that stand in its way. And this is kind of a beautiful metaphor when you think about new ideas. And the question that we would ask you, or I would ask you today, is what is it that makes a new idea take flight? Now, most people's instinct is that the thing that makes a new idea take flight is the coolness of the idea itself, the messaging around the idea, the marketing around the idea, all of the features and benefits that make that idea interesting. We refer to all of these forces that move something towards progress as fuel. Fuel are the forces that incite change. Just like gunpowder in the barrel of a gun that pushes a bullet out the other end, fuel are things like sales and marketing and product development that make an idea compelling and make a product or strategy more interesting. But just like a bullet leaving a gun on its way to a target, new ideas also encounter a bunch of headwind. And we refer to these headwinds as frictions. These are the forces that oppose change, that push back against change, challenging a new idea on its way to the marketplace. And as human beings and as professionals, we tend to bias ourselves into thinking in fuel. For example, if somebody isn't accepting our new idea or our transformation strategy or our new organizational design, our instinct is there's something wrong with the idea. Either we haven't designed it properly, or maybe we haven't explained it clearly enough. So we'll explain it again, and we'll explain all of the features and benefits. But sometimes we fail to recognize that it isn't the desirability of the thing that's the problem. It's the audience that's ready to receive that thing that's the problem. And unless we design to minimize the headwind and minimize the friction that stands in their way, our ideas will fail to be successful in the market, just like a bullet that is not aerodynamic will fail to be successful in achieving its target. So why is it that we have fuel as a default mindset in the way we think? The answer is because we tend to see behavior as a result of internal forces and minimize situational causes. We think about the things that we can control. We think about the things that give our brains little dopamine hits of satisfaction when we achieve them. But the reality is it's not just the things that are in our control that lead to the success or failure of an idea. Many of these things are actually with the audience we're trying to change. For example, if you're driving down the freeway in Lisbon or somewhere else in the world, and you see somebody radically weaving in and out of traffic and speeding and effectively driving erratically, what is your explanation of why that's the case? Now, if you're like me, your explanation is that person is a terrible driver, or that person is a jerk, or that person must be inebriated. And we rarely pause to think, well, maybe that person is an emergency worker on their way to the scene of an accident. Or maybe that's a parent with a sick child in the back. Or maybe that's somebody who's got a full bladder in desperate need of a bathroom. We tend to look at things through the lens of our own experience and ignore the environmental and situational causes around us. And so it's this question about what helps people overcome the resistance to new ideas that prompted myself and my co-author Lauren Nordgren to write this book called The Human Element. And in The Human Element, we break down what we refer to as 4 primary frictions that stand in the way of any new idea. And unless these 4 frictions are addressed and remedied, they will continue to stifle any change initiative that you and your organization are trying to put forward. The first of these frictions answers this question. Does our new idea or our strategy or our change initiative represent a major break from the status quo, represent a major break from what people do today? The answer to this question determines the amount of friction of inertia present. Inertia is a human being's overwhelming desire to stick with things that are familiar. And as innovators and change agents, we often underestimate just how strong the tug of the status quo actually is. No matter how much somebody knows they ought to change, that new idea that you're bringing forward is inherently unfamiliar, and the human mind always favors familiarity over things that are unfamiliar. Kind of a beautiful example of this comes from a firm that's based in the UK called Public Digital. Public Digital is in the business of digital transformation, specifically focused on public organizations like governments, city and state governments, and national governments, as well as nonprofit and NGOs. And one of the things that Public Digital does when they're implementing a digital transformation project with their clients, first and foremost, is they don't call it digital transformation. When we refer to an initiative as digital transformation, the scope of it sounds enormous. The difficulty of it sounds extremely high. It sounds really ambiguous. So when we go to our organizations and say, we're going to undergo a digital transformation exercise or experience, many people in the organization get A, paralyzed by what that actually means, and B, intimidated by all of the unfamiliar elements that will likely follow. So instead of emphasizing the new or the unfamiliar, the way that Public Digital approaches digital transformation isn't by calling their initiatives digital transformation. It's by working with their clients and saying, what is the next significant change or next major initiative your company needs to undertake? Let's carve out that next project and let's say, what would it look like to do this particular project in a digital first way? So we're not trying to change the organization. We're going to tackle one specific project. And so what they do here is they shrink the size of the problem down to something smaller. And one of the several remedies we talk about in the book for overcoming the friction of inertia is starting small. Rather than think about the enormity of digital transformation, let's take this next important project and focus on what a digital first approach to that might be. And when we show the organization that it's effective, then we can hopefully recruit other people to the cause. And they might say, hey, that was really successful what you did with that one project. How might we apply those approaches and philosophies to this other project? So not only do they start small, but they share out the results along the way and create what we refer to as a beacon project, something that shines a light on how a new way of working can actually be meaningful for the broader organization. The second friction we talk about is the answer to this question. What is the costliness of implementation? And this might mean economic cost, but also how much physical exertion is required to implement the change. How much mental exertion, how much cognitive load is required to execute the change? The answer to these questions determines the amount of effort-related friction present in any change initiative. And a great example of effort, friction, and action comes from something that I'm guessing many of you have seen around the towns and cities you live in. Have you ever walked through a public park and seen something like this, where there's a paved footpath around the park, and then there are these dirt trails on diagonals through the park that were clearly formed by human feet? These diagonal paths that cut through park settings are called desire paths. These are the paths that human beings make with their own feet that show the landscape designers, that show the park designers how people prefer to travel, the one that requires them to have the minimal amount of effort in order to make it to their destination. Desire paths are kind of a beautiful metaphor for effort. Human beings always seek out the path of least effort. And this means physical exertion, like walking from one place to another, but it also means things when it comes to software design. What is the minimal amount of effort, both physical, but also cognitive load I need to implement in order to make it through one software journey from the beginning to the end? In fact, as part of this book, we interviewed a bunch of interaction designers and software designers and asked them, in the last 10 years, what would you say is the greatest effort-reducing innovation in software design? And overwhelmingly, the popular response we got from these interaction and software designers was the advent of what we call autocomplete. These are those little bits of code in JavaScript that when you're filling out an application online, the moment you type the first initial of your first name will auto-populate the rest of the form with your personal contact information. Or if you're purchasing something in an e-commerce location, it will automatically complete your credit card and billing information. And the reason that this is such a powerful innovation, even though adding a detail about your personal information or adding a phone number doesn't seem like that big of a deal, when viewed in concert with all of the 15 or 20 fields you need to fill out, you might be surprised how much patience people will have for completing one of these forms. It might not be their first name that causes the problem. It might not be entering their family name that causes the problem. But maybe by the time you get down to their postal code, they might be like, you know what? Forget it. I don't have time for this, and churn out of an experience. So even though they found the software desirable enough to download, or even though they found the e-commerce, the product on an e-commerce website desirable enough to purchase, the process of actually inputting the information to execute the sale becomes so laborious that people actually churn out. We underestimate just how big of a deal small bits of effort can make. And it's not just in software, it's also in strategy. It's also in sales. The more we ask people to give physically and mentally, the easier it is for them to abandon the experience and churn out. This is the friction of effort at play. The third friction is this one, or answers this question. What negative feelings might our idea produce in others? These are the anxieties, trepidations, nervousness, and fear we cause in others simply by bringing a new thing to the market. This is the friction of effort. The friction of emotion. And any time we ask somebody to change from what they're familiar with to something new, there will always be anxiety. There will always be trepidation. And sometimes, unbeknownst to us, we are the ones causing it. There was an experience I had a few years ago where I was invited to give a design talk to a bunch of procurement professionals at a procurement conference here in the United States. And I sat down with a bunch of chief procurement officers from some very large companies at lunch. And at the time, I was wearing a hat thinking about how might I sell consulting services to these individuals. And I sat next to the chief procurement officer of one of these major banks. And I asked this person, So if I'm trying to sell you consulting services, is it in my best interest and your best interest for me to come to the table with the most heavily discounted pricing I can offer, the best and final pricing, and to show you very clearly how I discounted those prices so that we can minimize the amount of time it will take for us to negotiate and we can get started on the work as quickly as possible. So I'm thinking to myself, I'm going to minimize the amount of effort required for this profession, for this professional to execute their job in procurement and make it easier for him and make it easier for me. And his response to me when I put forward this idea was, please don't do that. And I said, well, why not? He said, well, if you come in with best and final pricing and find all the discounts yourself, how am I showing value to my organization? How am I showing value to my CEO or my CFO? And it never occurred to me that by minimizing the amount of effort I was bringing to this person, I actually increased their emotional friction by causing them to feel obsolete or irrelevant to the people that matter to them in their organization. So be mindful of the fact that sometimes when we reduce one friction, we actually inadvertently add another. And this is particularly profound when it comes to the friction of emotion. And finally, the fourth friction we talk about in the human element is the answer to this question. Does our audience feel pressured to change? Do they feel like change is being imposed upon them, or do they feel like they've got a choice in the decision? Do they feel like this is happening all of a sudden, or is it happening gradually? When we feel like change is being pushed on us, we as human beings have a tendency to push back against that change with equal or greater force. I think we see this friction, which we call reactance, showing up all over the world right now as it relates to public health, as it relates to other issues. If you're trying to get somebody to take a COVID vaccine or wear a mask, there are some people for whom no amount of data will suffice. In fact, the more data you present to them, the actual stronger their position becomes, because it's not about data. It's not about data that's preventing them from saying yes to a mask or a vaccine. It's about autonomy. They feel like they are losing autonomy, the control over their own life. And one of the things that human beings value above all else is the freedom to think that they are in control of their own experience. And when they feel like that's being taken away from them, it causes problems. And that is a demonstration of the friction of reactance. In fact, we're seeing in the United States this showing up quite a bit in employment. We're having a moment right now that we call the Great Resignation, where millions of American workers are resigning from their jobs week or month over month. And employers, their instinct is, well, maybe this is a benefits problem. Maybe we're not paying them enough. Maybe we're not giving them enough perks. Maybe we're making it too hard for them to come back into the office. And what they fail to realize is that maybe it isn't about perks. Maybe it's not about compensation. Maybe it's about employees who feel like they've gotten used to having full control over their time for the last two years during the pandemic, feel like now that they have to go into the office, that autonomy that they've come to enjoy is being taken away from them. So it's not a benefits issue, it's an autonomy issue. So these four frictions show up in every single change, whether it's a business change or a social change, or you're negotiating with your kids or whatever it might be. Inertia, effort, emotion, and reactance are always present, undermining your efforts. So unless we spot them in advance and mitigate them, we will never actually successfully achieve the change we desire, because we will be very focused on fuel and underappreciate and underestimate the amount of friction present. So what's the big idea here in this talk in the last few minutes? It's this: removing friction is often more powerful than increasing fuel. We tend to believe that if people don't say yes to our idea, there's something wrong with the idea. Instead, I would encourage you to think that maybe it's not the idea or the initiative that's the problem. It's all of these sources of friction standing in the way. And if we as change makers and innovators and advisors can spot those frictions and minimize them, those changes will happen easily and seamlessly and elegantly. So my parting words to you: look for frictions, remove frictions, and I promise you your change initiatives will be much, much easier than in the past. I want to thank Unipartner for inviting me to join this session. I hope I will get to meet all of you in person at some point. Have a great rest of the conference, and thank you.